The UN's first ever virtual meeting of world leaders kicks off today. Some of the biggest powers on the planet will be giving pre-recorded speeches throughout the week. Most of them, of course, stuck at home by the coronavirus pandemic. That's likely to be a major theme of these talks. Among those set to speak today, Russia's Vladimir Putin, Chinese leader Xi Jinping, and Donald Trump. For more on his talks, I'm joined on the set now by France 24's James André. James, there's a lot of expectations about what Donald Trump is going to say today. What are we expecting?
Well, Donald Trump right now is pretty much obsessed by his legacy and the upcoming election in 6 weeks. So what we are expecting is actually a lot of not very multilateral moves, as in he has already said that he would be speaking about China, though we don't know exactly what he's going to say. One thing we pretty much do know what he's going to say about is Iran. Now, it is widely expected for Donald Trump to indeed sort of talk about the normalization of the relations between Israel and Bahrain, Israel and the United Arab Emirates, that has just been sealed under, American with America pushing behind it for this to happen. And indeed, the common enemy, if you will, and common enemy as well with Saudi Arabia, of course, is Iran. And Donald Trump wants to show that he's tough on Iran also before this election, because as you know, it was one of his main campaign arguments back in 2016 that it was a bad agreement, that it needed to be tore up. So, indeed, there have been new sanctions that have been announced yesterday, on Monday, by Mike Pompeo. Those are actually unilateral U.S. sanctions, but there's also, and that was on Saturday, the U.S. called upon the UN to reinstate the famous step back of the sanctions after it stepped out of the nuclear deal, of the Vienna nuclear deal, the JCPOA.
One thing we noticed when Donald Trump spoke the last time at the UN was there was some laughter, not planned, at some of the things that the U.S. president can come out with. One thing that we'll probably notice again today is that the U.S., for much of the world, is very much alone.
Now, it is very much alone, and indeed, for example, France, Germany, and the UK have made it known that they do not agree with this policy. They wrote a letter to the US and to the UN saying that the move by the US of asking for a snapback of these sanctions is illegal in their view, and that the US cannot ask for that by themselves. Then China, Russia have also made it known that they do not agree with these decisions. But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to the US, well, they do have the power to impose their views. And this is thanks to a certain amount of measures, such as, for example, the specially designated nationals, which is a move by the US to bar people or organizations from doing business in the US. It's also, for example, the fact that they can freeze assets in the country. And when you see what happened when, for example, the US stepped out of the nuclear accord unilaterally, that was back in 2017, well, just after that, despite the fact that France did not agree with the move, did not recognize the move, well, French corporations had to leave Iran, stop doing business with Iran, simply because it could have cost them much too much money. For example, everybody remembers what happened to BNP Paribas. That was back in 2014. BNP Paribas was fined by the US government $8.9 billion because they were carrying on doing business with Sudan, Cuba, and Iran. Despite embargoes, well, the chances are they might do the same thing this time, forcing obviously their partners not to do business with Iran. What they're targeting very clearly with what was announced yesterday is arms sales by Russia and China to Iran. That is more difficult for them to enforce, but there could be consequences.
James, thanks for that. France 24's James André.